as an investor, if I do my fundamental research on a company and have a really strong conviction that the stock's going to do well. But at the same time, I have that concern about their ESG score that I may find on Ethos. Um, how do I weigh that, conviction about wanting to make money in this company, but wanting to align my investments with my beliefs?
Yeah, I think it's really a personal preference for every investor, how much you weigh financial performance and risk versus impact or ESG considerations. Um, I think financial well-being and performance is very important, and that's also one of our core values at Ethos. We do really care about impact and ESG considerations, but financial well-being of investors is also a core value for us. And most investors are going to consider both return and impact in their decisions. I think what's also interesting is that increasingly ESG scores and returns are not necessarily opposed or at odds. There are, of course, conflicting opinions on this, but a lot of research over the last 3 years and going back a lot farther shows a pretty strong correlation or some correlation between ESG performance and financial performance over the long term. And there are many reasons for that, but I think it's not necessarily weighing one against the other. If there's a particular stock that scores poorly, then that's really up to your personal values in terms of how much you want to invest in that.
Interesting. I think we've noticed in different companies that there are some companies who are out there that try to check all the boxes on ESG. They want to be good at everything. And there are other companies that, while they may not have a great score on every single category of ESG, their entire business model and their company's mission is to improve one certain aspect of ESG principles.
Yeah.
How do you look at those two companies against each other?
Yeah, I think from a few perspectives, if you're an individual investor, retail investor, I think it's important to define what causes are most important to you, because every large corporation is going to have mixed impact generally across ESG causes. One may be great for climate action, maybe it is reducing its carbon emissions incredibly, but it may also have a poor social record or a poor treatment of its employees. It's going to be tough to find any single company that is fully that performs great across all ESG scores. So if you define what's most important to you, you can prioritize and say, I really care about X. I'm going to find investments that are best for that. If you want to take more of a across the board perspective, like it is still important to look at what's most important to you, but you can prioritize somewhat across those. For individual companies, say one that often gets cited as an example is Tesla, maybe doing great things potentially for reducing long-term emissions and for a more sustainable future with electric vehicles, obviously. But it often scores poorly on some of the more S or social metrics for treatment of employees, for example, or some of the other social metrics. A lot of ESG ratings agencies will rate them as mediocre. So that, again, is, I think, personal preference. If you really care about the environment and believe that Tesla is making a great impact on long-term sustainability, then it's a great investment. And you may not be as concerned about some of the mitigating social factors. But again, it comes down to personal preference as a retail investor.
Interesting. I love that example. There's so much publicity about Tesla on both sides. There are, a lot of opinions, and just sort of be able to cut through that is very important.
Yeah.
Cool. Moving on to talk a little bit more about the companies themselves, rather than from the perspective of an investor. I think a lot of attention, especially in the media, is paid to the environmental and social impact, those really tangible impacts on society. But there's a third letter in ESG, which is the G for governance. Maybe you want to explain a little bit about what governance is and how it stacks up against these other factors.
Yeah, I think governance, generally, it's how well a company manages its risks, at least as relates to ESG. It's how well it is managing its risks and how well its policies and practices, so the actual management decisions that it makes and puts into place. I would categorize those as governance. So for example, for diversity or policies and practices around corruption, supply chain policies and practices, as opposed to specific outcomes or environment or very directly environmental or social metrics. I tend to see governance as an enabler of the other two, as well as its own factor. Strong governance can mean having the processes and people in place to help you better assess and mitigate E and S metrics. So for example, one of the common governance metrics that I mentioned, board diversity, that this can help an organization enable diversity and prioritize diversity throughout the whole organization from the top down, and help the organization improve some of its other diversity and inclusion and social metrics. One other example is avoiding involvement and corruption throughout a supply chain. So how strong and how robust of policies and how well are its practices relating to managing and avoiding involvement and corruption throughout the supply chain. This obviously has implications for a company's social impact on things like employee treatment throughout the supply chain and involvement in modern day slavery and that kind of thing. So it really is somewhat overlapping. It's not, as consultants say, extremely MECE or mutually exclusive and comprehensive. It is somewhat overlapping, but it is very important for enabling as well as having impact on its own.
Interesting. With ESG disclosures, there's no real federal framework, and a lot of these companies have to create them themselves. Maybe you want to talk about a company that you think would be the gold standard for ESG reporting and why.
Yeah, I think there are quite a few that are great at ESG reporting. A few that I would cite as examples here in the US could be Salesforce. It does a great job. Bank of America is doing pretty well. Pepsi, MasterCard, a couple others. I think it just comes down to how robust is their reporting and how credible is it, and how much do they align with internationally recognized reporting frameworks like GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, or SASB and other reporting initiatives. It tends to be easier for large organizations and often for consumer-facing organizations that have, I would say, more of an incentive to improve their reporting, to demonstrate and show that they are responding to some of the major trends over the last several years, looking at increased the social justice movement and increased attention to the climate change urgency. Large consumer-facing organizations tend to have more of an incentive to report on it, especially if they are doing well. If you are in an industry like technology or a consumer goods industry, and if you're doing well on some of these metrics, you really have an incentive to report transparently and really robustly. And that is often what we see. Some of the best examples are technology, some consumer goods companies that are doing great things and then are promoting that. Some of the more B2B or other industries such as energy and industrials tend to have less direct consumer-facing demand or interest in pushing them to do more reporting. So they, as you might guess, have lagged a fair amount in the ESG reporting.
As ESG frameworks begin to be implemented in the EU, how likely do you think it is that we'll see a federal ESG reporting framework come to the US?
I think it's very likely. The question is when. I think not if. I'm optimistic that there will be some new changes, some guidance at least under the current administration. I think that catching up to the EU in terms of our regulations and requirements, so it's probably a little bit farther off. But I think we're moving in that direction, and the momentum for ESG reporting, the consumer-driven momentum, is and will continue to grow. So I think it is just a question of when, not if. And this is really a critical question for any investor who cares about impact or ESG. Corporate reporting is currently just so non-standard and non-transparent. It's really pretty tough to compare, so the company's self-reported data, to compare company A to company B. A lot of the data, the ESG data and ESG ratings that are out there will look at company data, but will really supplement with third-party analyses and third-party information. having a standard, transparent framework just will allow for a much more apples to apples comparison and allow for much easier consideration of where is the impact actually happening, and where can we actually have an impact with our investments.
Interesting. As an individual investor, as these frameworks, come to fruition in the EU and maybe someday in the US, how do you think it will impact my ability to look into a company and know the impact they're making?
Yeah, I think you'll see a subsequent explosion of resources somewhat similar to Ethos that aggregate public information. If it's much easier to aggregate or to collect standardized information, you'll see a lot more integrations into online brokerages, into your bank accounts or bank information. A lot of online tools that retail investors use will integrate more of this information because it will be so much easier for them to do so. It will be readily available and structured and easier to integrate. So yeah, I anticipate it being much easier as a retail investor, trickling down from the corporate reporting to see what is the impact of my portfolio and how much, for example, carbon emissions am I contributing to, or what's the expected global warming impact of my portfolio, or what is the average pay equity of my portfolio. Those kinds of metrics will be much more common and easier to use and easier to have trust in as reliable metrics.
And as these are all really dispersed and confusing, that's really the problem that Ethos is solving right now.
Yeah, that is what we try to solve right now. It's wherever there is sufficiently high quality reporting from companies, we'll use company self-reported data, but we always supplement that with third-party analysis or our own analysis, third-party ratings, to try to get around some of the problems that are caused by the lack of transparent standard reporting today. Yeah, we're very much excited about improved standardization, improved transparency. This will make our jobs easier, and also just make anyone who cares about impact and ESG considerations, it'll make it a much more impactful and more credible field in general.
It sounds like there are some really exciting things on the horizon for impact investing.
Yeah, hopefully.
Now, if we take a perspective of a company, right, I'm the CEO of a public company. What are some of the biggest changes that we can make as a company, right, hypothetically, that are realistic and measurable that will increase our ESG?
Yeah, you have to look obviously at the cost and time and energy required to do any of these initiatives, and then make the business decision that's right for your business. But I think all businesses of all sizes are seeing the increasing demand from customers, from consumers for more reporting. So there are many ways that businesses of all sizes can get started, and depending on your resources available, you can scale them up as much as you want. But some that I would suggest initially are looking at your carbon emissions. There are a variety of frameworks for assessing your carbon emissions and carbon intensity across your immediate operations, as well as your purchases of things like electricity and other carbon generating resources, and then also across your supply chain. There are a lot of resources out there that are public that make it easy to estimate your carbon intensity and carbon emissions. I would also look at specific policies and practices that you have in place, so you can display publicly on your website, elsewhere, to suppliers, to ESG ratings agencies, around things like a modern slavery statement, or pay equity statements, or supply chain rights statements, things like that can demonstrate your commitment to more of the social issues or social causes in your own operations and throughout your supply chain. Those are relatively low cost things that you can do. I would also then, if you have the resources, start looking at other types of resources that you use, things like waste generated, water use, things that are widely used across ESG ratings agencies. The more of the natural resources or I think things like waste and water are usually included in every ESG rating. So I would start there and then look at some of the other social metrics, and then also look at a few of the frameworks that are out there for companies and just see what else is doable for you. So look at the GRI or SASB reporting frameworks, and see which of those metrics are doable within your resource constraints.
Quite interesting. With all these different companies having many methods to improve their ESG score, are there any companies out there that you think are more or less unredeemable from an ESG perspective?
Yeah, I don't think that any specific company is. I think there are some industries and business models that are tough. So oil and gas, for example, or fossil fuel-based industries or business models are tough to make the case that they can be turned into a positive ESG impact industry or business model. As we saw a couple of weeks ago with the ExxonMobil and Chevron shareholder actions, I think there's increasing awareness that these companies need to shift their business model and that it's very doable. And will be increasingly important for their long-term sustainability as businesses to move away from some of the really negative ESG business models like fossil fuel extraction, to finding alternatives and finding different ways to still perform and use some of their existing capabilities, but just in a less negative or positive way. I think any company can do that. It's obviously more difficult for some than others.
Interesting. Well, taking a look at what's been going on in recent weeks, the infrastructure bill is making its way through Congress, and it seems very likely that there will be hundreds of billions of dollars carved out to combat climate change. What impact could this have on public companies?
Yeah, hopefully the incentives in the bill will help public companies continue to shift, to accelerate their existing shifts to more sustainable business models. So things like looking at the raw materials that go into cement or raw materials that go into infrastructure construction, shifting away from the more resource intensive, fossil fuel intensive materials to more sustainable materials, for example. There are a whole variety of ways that hopefully that public companies can shift can continue and accelerate shifting their business models to more sustainable ideas, products, services. So developing new clean energy is a clear, obvious one. Developing AI for more efficient manufacturing, for example, is another one. Just continuing that shift away from very resource intense activities to making them more sustainable.
Awesome. I've learned a ton in such a short time, Luke. Thanks so much. Before we wrap up, I'd love to learn a little bit more about where I can actually start using Ethos and make my investments aligned with my beliefs.
Yeah, Ethos has a free version for every retail investor. You can go to ethosesg.com and find investments, brands, companies, funds that align with your causes, your values. It's completely free. We also have a version for financial advisors and wealth managers and other financial institutions that helps look at in-depth portfolio analytics, portfolio construction, impact reporting. But we have a free version and would love for you to check us out at ethosesg.com. Amazing.
Thank you, Luke. We were so excited to have you on as our first ever guest of Toggle Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, stay tuned. Check us out at toggle.global, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on Toggle Talks. We continue our conversation with Luke, touching on many aspects of ESG and teaching you how to make investment decisions that align with your beliefs. If you want early access to the full 25-minute episode, you can find Toggle Talks on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay updated as we release the next episodes of this 4-part series. If you want to learn more about Ethos, you can check them out at ethosesg.com. Until next time, happy investing.